Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Okay, are you ready for part two? I don't think that you are because I'm not. I'm not ready to talk about it, honestly. The first part of this case was absolutely horrible, but part two is in a league of its own, honestly. And if you haven't watched part one, I will link it right now. You might just want to pop over and watch that one first because you're probably going to be a little bit lost if you don't. I will give a very, very brief recap before we get started on part two. Several celebrities pop up in part two. And actually, one celebrity cameo that I forgot to mention in part one was none other than the king of rock and roll himself, Elvis Presley. I was running through my notes in preparation for part two, and I just happened to be glancing through part one, and somehow I missed that huge part about Elvis. It's so random, it's so weird, so I just have to quickly mention it in the recap. I do want to say thank you for the response that I had from my last video. As of right now, as I'm filming, that video is sitting at just under 2,000 views, which I know does not sound like a lot in the grand scheme of things. There's so many awesome creators on YouTube that have millions and millions of views, but I'm brand new, and so this was like one of my first goals that I set for myself was to put out a video that got over 1,000 views within a certain amount of time, and I finally hit that goal. And I just want to say I really appreciate it. I truly appreciate each and every click, every like, every comment, every subscriber that I get. So I just want to say thank you. And like I said, part one was bad. Part two is much worse. We will be talking extensively about physical and sexual child abuse. So you might just want to consider that before you continue to watch this video. This cult went on for decades. So there's a very good chance that this video is going to be very long, and I'm really sorry about that. Grab a coffee, grab a snack, grab an entire meal if you want. I've got my coffee right here. Just sit back, relax, and let's get into the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Ministries cult, part two. So in part one, we left off with basically the cult forming. It's in its infancy. It's just getting started out. It's in Ed's house. Ed is Susan's daughter, Chris. That's her boyfriend. And Ed's house is actually in Hollywood on Carlos Avenue. And it's a pretty small house, but more and more people are starting to show up each night to hear Susan give her famous sermons. And Susan is married to this guy named Tony. He's a con artist. Susan herself is also a con artist. And the part that I forgot to mention involving Elvis actually had to do with Susan and Tony's wedding that they had in Vegas. So right before they decided to get married, Susan and Tony had some people that were kind of living with them, some like kids, I guess, just people that didn't really have anywhere to go. Susan, Tony, these kids that were living with them, and then Chris, Susan's daughter, all pack up in Susan's car, and she drives them over to where Elvis's mansion is. She goes straight to the gate, she pulls up, and there's an intercom, and the guard comes over the intercom, and he's like, "Can I help you? What are you doing here?" Susan just tells this guard that she's there to basically help Elvis save his soul. And unbelievably, well, or actually believably, if you watched part one, you'd know that Susan seriously can talk anyone into anything. And that's exactly what happened in this case. The guard lets her in, and they all go into Elvis's house. Elvis comes down and he starts talking to them. Susan starts preaching to him about him being a sinner and all this stuff and how she wanted to help him to save his soul. She was trying to recruit Elvis. She knew she was good at giving sermons, and so she was already thinking like she could make something of this even before the actual cult itself got started. Elvis was just kind of seemed to be a little bit weirded out by this, but he was captivated enough by Susan to give her $5,000. He wasn't going to join this little endeavor that she was trying to create, but he did give her this $5,000 check, and that was the money that she and Tony used to go to Vegas, fund their wedding, and start their life in Vegas where they were doing cons there as well. So that's the part that I forgot to mention about Elvis. And like I said, I cannot believe that I forgot to mention that part because it's so weird and so random. When I read it, I was like, is this real? And then I started, doing more and more research. And yes, this was real. This really happened. She tried to recruit Elvis Presley. Even though he didn't join, he did give her $5,000. So I don't know. I just found that super bizarre, so I needed to mention it. So at the end of part 1, we left off with Susan and Tony starting this cult. Basically, they didn't call it a cult, they called it a church, but they started their church in Ed's house, and every night they were giving these really long sermons, these huge services, and more people were starting to come to these nightly services to hear Susan preach. She was starting to really make a name for herself in the neighborhood. So that's kind of where we left off on part 1. But like I said, I highly recommend that if you haven't seen part 1, you go watch it, because there's so much stuff that happens. Now, this church they started in Ed's house, they went on to call it the Music Square Church. So that's what they became known as in the neighborhood. And Susan began recruiting more and more people off the streets. She would typically send her current followers, people who had started coming to these nightly services and just started kind of hanging around the Alamos, hanging around Ed's house a lot. She started recruiting them along with her daughter Chris and Chris's boyfriend Ed to go into the streets and street preach. They would hand out leaflets and basically yell at people to repent or perish. And I'm sure that you've seen people like this on the streets before. I know that I have. Whenever I was in college, we had people like this on campus all the time. And they would basically set up shop like right outside of the student center and essentially just scream at people as we'd walk by. And it was super uncomfortable and very unsettling every time it happened. And I felt like it happened quite a bit at my college. But yeah, that's basically what they were doing. And they didn't care who was walking by. They tried to recruit anyone, really. But they definitely would hone in on certain people. Typically, these people were referred to as dirty hippies, or people who seemed to be homeless, people who looked like they were just kind of like lost in a way. It's the 60s at this point in California, and at this time there were so many young people that were coming in from all over the US. California was a very popular place at that time for young people who wanted to break away from their small hometowns and wanted to experience something bigger. And of course, we know that this is kind of like the birthplace of the hippie movement, so there were a lot of people that fell under Susan and Tony's umbrella of dirty hippies, I guess. That's not me saying that, by the way. That's what Susan and Tony called them. So yeah, Susan was growing her Christian army. And in the beginning, there were about 20 or 30 people that really hung around the church quite a bit. And those people became very loyal followers of Susan's. Susan and Tony were in this together, but Susan was really the main attraction. That's really who people came to see. And then Susan and Tony started inviting their most loyal followers to come move into the church, and they would just sleep on the floor. And now at this point, Susan and Tony are not living at the church. They're actually just giving these nightly services there. They still have a little apartment of their own where they technically like sleep and they go to do whatever. And in the beginning, it was mostly like older teenage boys and very young men that were living there. But eventually these men would invite their wives or their girlfriends to come move in as well. So over time, there were quite a few people that started living in the church. And the new followers that they would get in were referred to as baby Christians. That's the term that Susan came up with to refer to her newfound followers. And whenever they would be sent out into the streets to recruit, there was a very meticulous system put in place. They kind of had a structure that they followed. So first, they would, like I said, yell at people. They would be preaching very loudly, handing out leaflets. And if they got anyone actually interested in listening to what they had to say, they would just start talking to them all about the church, talking to them about Susan and Tony. And then they would tell them, you should come listen to one of the services. You should come over tonight and come just stay for one of the services. You'll get a free meal. And if you want to leave, no problem. You're free to go. And if you watched part 1, I know what you're thinking. Free meal? Free? Like, this doesn't sound like Susan and Tony at all. They do not give anything to anyone for any reason. They are takers, both of them. And you'd be right to be suspicious of this free meal. This food had actually been dug out of local dumpsters by the current members. You heard that right. These potential cult members were offered a passionate sermon, eternal salvation, and a buffet of hot garbage. So then once they would pull these people in, they would tell them, be at the church at 8, services start around then. They would arrive, they would sit down in one of the seats, and then one of the current members would be instructed to go sit right next to one of these potential members. And then Susan would come up and she would begin giving one of her fire and brimstone services that she loved to give. She would tell them that the end of the world is coming and the second coming of Jesus is very near. And Susan would also tell these people that she had terminal cancer and that she had actually managed to save herself through the power of prayer and faith. And Susan's daughter, Chris, later said that this was all a lie, that her mother had lied about having cancer for years. And then later on, she would use this whole cancer thing as a way to kind of gauge the faith of her followers. Of course, she knew that she wasn't actually sick, but she would tell them, I'm well right now because you're here, you're praying for me, you are a faithful, loyal follower. That's the only reason why I'm still living right now. So her followers started thinking that they were responsible for her health, and so they felt like it was their duty to just constantly pray and have as much faith as possible and to be as loyal as possible. And like any respectable cult, you need a boogeyman. You need someone for your followers to fear, someone that you can use as a means to keep your followers loyal and keep them there with you. And the Alamos boogeyman of choice just happened to be the Catholic Church. Susan and Tony, especially Susan, absolutely hated the Catholic religion. So in these sermons, she would bash Catholicism frequently. They would tell these people that the Catholic Church was actually responsible for the assassination of John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln. So after Susan was done with that, she would then call Chris up to come and sing. And Chris would get up there and she would sing a gospel song. So then Tony would come up and he would give a testimonial about how he had converted to Christianity. And remember, Susan and Tony were actually originally born into Jewish families and at some point converted to Christianity. Tony's story about him converting to Christianity, I never found out if he was converting from Judaism to Christianity or if he just didn't believe in anything and he became a Christian. So yeah, I'm not really sure about exactly what he was converting from, but his story about how he converted to Christianity was very, very loosely based on his actual story of how he converted to Christianity. Because remember, Tony's a compulsive liar. And so this particular testimonial that he would give seemed to be extremely embellished. He would get up there and say how he had been this huge producer in the music industry. And he was so big, in fact, that he had his very own team of tailors, shoe shiners, drivers, bodyguards, all these different people. That's how powerful he was. And he would say that he was living this super lavish lifestyle and he was also living in sin. And that one day, him and several of his equally successful friends were sitting in a board meeting in this really fancy office. Out of nowhere, Tony said that he was struck deaf. And then he began to only hear the voice of God. And God was telling him that he was a prophet and that he needed to get the word out that the end was coming, the second coming of Jesus was near, and that he needed to denounce all this, lavish, sinful lifestyle that he was living, and he needed to devote himself completely to God. And then he instructed Tony to get on top of the boardroom table where all of these people were, and he needed to give them this message and then admonish them for all of their sins. Tony gets on top of this table and he does exactly what God tells him. And then he gets down and he walks out and he just completely walks away from this amazing life that he had been living. Okay, so first off, no. Tony was never big in the music industry. He was a total fraud. He was an absolute con man. Any dime he ever made had been stolen or conned from someone. Not to mention, according to his timeline, he would have raped Chris during this time when he was supposedly a prophet. And also, Tony conveniently left out the fact that he was completely wasted whenever this whole thing happened. I guess that little tidbit of information didn't make it into the final draft of his testimonial. And Susan and Tony would even take people down to the ocean and baptize them there. I'm sure that you've guessed what the motive is behind Susan and Tony starting this cult. It's not religion. It's not God. And I'm not saying that Tony and Susan didn't believe in God, but that is absolutely absolutely not why they started this whole thing. Their entire motivation was money. Plain and simple, that was it. They just wanted money. And most of the people that they had recruited at this point either had jobs, and then the rest of them were on welfare, because remember I said a lot of them were homeless. They were getting welfare checks, so they did have some source of income. So Susan and Tony would pull these poor people into their fold, make them feel super special by telling them that they were one of God's chosen people and that they had this really great higher purpose. Then eventually Susan would convince these people to sign their checks over to the church, which was really just Susan and Tony's pockets. I mean, if you have 20 or 30 people, and just spoiler here, this cult gets huge. Even at this time, if you got 20 or 30 people handing over their paychecks or their welfare checks, that's a significant amount of money. And in secret, Susan would actually refer to these checks as nut checks, because she said a lot of the members were on drugs and the welfare office people thought that they were crazy. And like I said, there were members that actually did have regular jobs, and same thing would happen to them. They would be made to feel super special. They would be told that they had a higher purpose, and then they would basically be convinced that the right thing to do would be to give up all of their worldly possessions, all of their money, and hand it over to God, which was the church, which was actually Tony and Susan. So as membership of the cult began to grow, Ed's little house on Carlos Avenue just wasn't cutting it anymore. There were just way too many people hanging around all the time. It was becoming a nuisance for the neighborhood. The neighbors started constantly calling the LAPD. And at first, whenever the police came out, of course, Susan was able to charm them. But eventually it just got to be too much. Some of these cult members were like holding up traffic and stuff. They were standing in the middle of the streets yelling at people. It just started to become a huge nuisance. So eventually even Susan's charms just weren't working on the police department. And so they were just constantly there. So eventually it got to where the police were showing up almost nightly to shut down the services. So in 1969, the Alamos decide that they need to move so that they can get out of the LAPD jurisdiction. So they end up getting this house. It was like a 2-story house in West Hollywood on Crescent Heights Boulevard. And this house was right by the Sunset Strip, which is a really busy area. So it was actually a perfect situation for them, because they could literally just walk out their door and onto the next street and start doing their preaching. There were tons of businesses and restaurants and stuff around, so this was kind of like their perfect hunting ground. And once they moved to this house, they actually ended up filing the paperwork that they needed to become an official church organization. So they officially became the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation. And they did this so that they could get tax exempt status, so they wouldn't have to pay taxes on anything. And another significant thing that started to happen whenever they moved into this house was that they started to get really, really controlling of their members. They began to put very strict rules in place, and you were forced to follow them without question. So you couldn't flirt with anyone or have any romantic relationships unless Tony and Susan approved them. You could never criticize the foundation or the Alamos. You could never question anything that the Alamos said to do. You had to do everything just blindly, without question, all the time. And you were absolutely never allowed to hide money from the foundation. If they found out that you were hiding money, they would accuse you of being demon possessed, and you could potentially be kicked out of the cult. And they also started appointing positions of authority within the cult, so they're starting to kind of establish a structure here. So some of the more loyal people, like the people that were really close to the Alamos, were appointed as something that they called overseers. And these overseers would kind of watch over things whenever Tony and Susan were not there. And by watch over things, I basically mean they were the tattletales of the cult. And they were also in charge of 2 lists that had been implemented into the cult: the put on report list and the ask Tony list. And from what I can gather, the put on report list is exactly what it sounds like. It was basically like a list of offenses. And the ask Tony list, oh my God. So the ask Tony list was a list of written requests submitted by the followers to basically do anything that they wanted to do. They had to get Tony's permission. So they would submit this list, and they would have to wait on Tony to either say yes or no. And this could be anything. This could be taking their sick child to the hospital. This could be having lunch with a friend. So then these requests would be submitted to Tony, and you would have to wait on Tony to give permission, which really meant you were waiting on Susan to get permission, because Tony really didn't make any decisions. Susan made all the decisions. And when I read this, it kind of reminded me of like take your kid to work day, he was absolutely Susan's sidekick. She was the brains of that operation. She was the main attraction. She was the one that people really followed. So at this point in the story, Chris is still with Ed, and they are basically living as this little family with Tiffany, and they are living in the church. So Susan, even though she does like Ed, she doesn't like the fact that her daughter is unwed and she's living in sin with her boyfriend and her baby. So she starts really pressuring Ed and Chris to get married. And at this point, Ed is starting to really be pulled into the cult. And Chris can tell that this is happening. She's complying with everything that her mom is telling her to do, but she knows the truth. But Chris can feel Ed slipping away. She can tell that he's being pulled in. So she's starting to just really get nervous about their relationship. But Chris really cares about Ed, and she doesn't want to break up with him or to leave him. She just doesn't know if she wants to get married, because she can tell that he's slipping away a little bit as far as mentally. Like, he's really starting to just get completely entangled with this whole cult thing and with her mom. So she's very worried about the future with Ed. And Ed starts telling Chris that they needed to get married too. But Chris is worried that he's only doing this because Susan wants him to marry her. So she decides to devise a test. She wants to make sure that Ed's loyalties still lie with her and not with the cult and not with her mother. So she tells Ed that she loves him, but she wants to leave the cult. And she did this just to see what his reaction would be. Ed actually passes this test. He tells Chris that even though he really wants to stay and he really wants to devote himself to God, that he couldn't imagine life without Chris, and he doesn't want to lose her. So Chris took this as a sign that, okay, he's still here with me. He's still loyal to me. I can work with this. And so if he does eventually ask me to marry him, I'm probably going to say yes. And that's what happens. Ed eventually does ask Chris to marry him, and she says yes. Things are actually really good. They have this like little wedding. Everything's going great. She kind of has this almost like a little bachelorette party thing before she gets married. She's really excited about it. She's got a dress and everything. And her mom's going to officiate the wedding. So she's actually looking forward to this. But if there's one thing we've learned in this case, it's that Chris is not allowed to be happy because Susan will inevitably ruin everything. So like I said, Susan was supposed to officiate the wedding, but at the very last second, she decides that she thinks it would be inappropriate for her to be the one to marry Chris and Ed. So she decides that Tony's going to marry them. And let's just pause for a minute and just take a little stroll down memory lane. Tony raped Chris when she was about 15 or 16 when they were living in Vegas. He raped her, then denied it, and Susan took Tony's side. Chris absolutely despises Tony. She hates him. He absolutely disgusts her. He makes her skin crawl. He had totally, completely violated her. And now this man, her rapist, is the one that is going to officiate her wedding, the day that's supposed to be one of the best days of her entire life. And I honestly just can't imagine how Chris must have felt in that moment. And I don't know if Ed knew what Tony had done to Chris. I just can't imagine how she must have felt standing up there next to him. And Susan thinks this is the more appropriate option. But once again, Susan can't let Chris be happy. She always has to ruin it in some way. So Chris and Ed eventually do end up having one child together. They have a daughter named Sarah. And yeah, they're just living together as this little family within the cult. It's her and Ed, her daughter Tiffany, and now their daughter together, Sarah. And honestly, pretty quickly after Sarah is born, their relationship is just crumbling. It had started pretty soon after they got married, but it really started to go downhill after Chris had Sarah. He was just becoming more and more brainwashed, and she just couldn't look at him the same anymore. He just wasn't the same person. And so it just drove a wedge between them, and eventually their relationship broke completely down. And one very defining moment for Chris was when her father passed away. He had gotten into a car accident, and Chris was called down to the coroner's office to go identify his body. And he had been completely destroyed by this car accident. His body was completely mangled, and Chris had to go down there and identify him. And it completely sucked the life out of her. She was absolutely devastated. And she comes home from the coroner's office that night, and all she wants to do is get into bed and have Ed like cuddle her. So Chris gets into bed that night and Ed comes over to her and he puts his arms around her and he's kind of like cuddling her. But then he starts trying to kind of like fill around, like he's trying to get something going, if you know what I mean. Chris, of course, is in no mood for this. She's completely devastated. Her father has just died and she had to go identify his body. And so she kind of like moves away. She moves to the other side of the bed and she's just kind of like curled up. Obviously doesn't want to be touched. But again, Ed goes over to her and tries to get something going again. Chris tells him, like, are you serious right now? I just got through identifying my father's body. Like, what are you doing? Ed just acts like a total baby. He goes over to the other side of the bed and he's all pouting and everything. He says to her that it is her wifely duty to have sex with him. And oh my God, are you freaking serious? I cannot even begin to tell you how much this enrages me. I hate that phrase under normal circumstances. But again, Chris had just lost her father and she just got back from identifying his body. And Ed tells her this. What? And this was pretty much the point where Chris knew that the old Ed was gone. He had been completely brainwashed by the cult because this is something that they definitely pushed. And Chris very quickly was just done with Ed. She was done with the cult. She was done with her mom. She wanted to get her kids out of there. She didn't want them growing up around all this and becoming brainwashed as well. So one day she gets up the courage to tell her mom that she wanted to leave the cult. And this was Chris's biggest mistake because she actually had way too much faith in her mom to actually have an adult conversation and not act like a sadistic baby whenever she told her she wanted to leave. But as soon as Chris goes up and tells Susan that she wants to leave, Susan tells her that she's going to kill her because there's no way she can let her leave because she knows way too much about what's going on within the cult, all the money that they're stealing, all the cons and all that stuff. So she tells Chris that she can't leave and that if she does, she's going to kill her. So Chris is pretty much used to this threat. She's been told by her mother that she's going to kill her several times. So she's just like, Mom, I promise, like, I'm not going to say anything to anyone. I'm not going to go to the authorities. I just want to get my kids out of here and away from all this. That's all I want. And Ed can stay. You guys can have Ed. He can go marry someone else. Like, I don't care. Just let me peacefully leave with my children. But Susan wasn't hearing any of that. She is furious. And so Chris knows she's not getting anywhere with Susan. So she just leaves the room. She goes back to her room and she starts packing. And at this point, it's Chris with her two daughters in her room while she's packing. And Chris actually does have a car, but I'm pretty sure this car was given to her by her mother. So she did not want her mom to be able to trace the car. She didn't want her mom to be able to like call and report the car stolen. So she ends up calling a cab. So the cab is now on its way. And then Susan and Tony and some of Susan's henchmen and Ed all start coming down towards the room. She kind of figured that it was going to get physical at some point. So she does kind of barricade the door, but Susan and her henchmen and Ed and Tony are all on the other side of the door and they're beating on it and they're trying to get in. And they do finally break into the room and they take Sarah out of Chris's arms because she had gotten afraid when they came to the door. So she was holding the baby, Sarah, in her arms. Tiffany was sitting on the bed and they take Sarah from Chris's arms and then they proceed to beat the hell out of Chris. And Tiffany is absolutely terrified. She's watching her grandmother and these men beat her mother. So while all this is going on, it's real chaotic and stuff, nobody realizes that the cab driver had actually arrived already and he's watching this go down. He's seeing what they're doing to Chris. And so he yells out, hey, stop that, get off of her, don't hit her. So then Susan and Tony very calmly go over to the cab driver and they start explaining to this cab driver that they are actually pastors from a church and they are doing an exorcism because Chris is possessed by the devil. Keep in mind, they have blood on their hands at this point because they have beaten Chris so badly that she is now bleeding. And then Tony takes out his wallet and hands the cab driver $100. And the cab driver just leaves. But luckily for Chris, she did have the foresight to call the cops before they came into the room. I think she kind of knew that things were going to get physical. So she did end up calling the cops at some point and they now show up. So they're banging on the outside door, like telling whoever's inside to let them in. And Susan is so angry with Chris for calling the cops. She's always trying to stay away from the cops. She doesn't want their eyes on them or the foundation. So she's really angry that Chris has done done this. So she gives the baby back to Chris, and she tells Tony that they need to go wash their hands and get all the blood off of their hands and everything. And they collect themselves, and then they go to the door and let the cops in. And they proceed to tell the cops that actually Chris was the aggressor. She had actually attacked all of them. And just to add insult to injury here, Ed, Chris's husband, the father of her child, tells the officers, yeah, that's exactly what happened. She attacked us. She's the one that's crazy. Like, something's wrong with her. They tell the cops that she's psychotic and all this stuff. So the cops end up getting a report from each person that's involved. And of course, all of them are on the same side. Chris is, off on her own here. And they all say that Chris was actually the aggressor, that she's the one that attacked them. And so now the cops come over to Chris and they want to know what's happened with her. Now they can see that she's been severely injured. She's bleeding from her head pretty badly. And they start asking her questions. She tells them everything. She tells them exactly what had actually happened. But it's their word against hers. So they say, what do you want us to do? They're saying this, you're saying that. What do you want us to do? So then she tells the cops that she wants them in prison. They need to be in jail right now for what they did to her. So then the cops then explain to Chris that if they take Tony and Susan into custody, they're going to have to take Chris as well because it's their word against hers. So they're blaming her and she's blaming them. So they would have to take all of them down to the jail. So Chris is just like, you know what? Whatever, I don't care if they're in jail. I just want my kids. I want to get out of here. Can you at least stay in the house and watch while I'll get my stuff together and get my kids out of here and call a cab? Honestly, the officers were kind of rude about it. They're just like, okay, fine. We don't have all day though, so you need to hurry up. Like, they were just kind of rude about it. I don't think at this point they realized exactly what was going on. I think that they actually thought that Chris could be responsible for some of what happened. So they're just kind of annoyed with her at this point, but they tell her that they'll stay. And so Chris starts packing up her stuff again, and she's got her daughters in there with her. And as she's packing, she sees the officer walk out of the house, and he's walking towards his cop car. So she goes to the door and she's like, hey, where are you going? I'm not done yet. And he goes, don't worry, I'm not leaving. I'm just going to my car. I got to go tell my partner something. Just hurry up, keep packing because we're starting to get calls in. Chris is like, okay. So she goes to her room and she's continuing to pack. And the last thing Chris remembers after that is seeing this really terrified look on Tiffany's face. And then Tiffany yells out, Mom. And when Chris finally regains consciousness, she realizes that her daughters are both gone. And she also realizes that she has been hit really hard in the head with a stationary phone. And she's bleeding profusely from the side of her head. But she really doesn't even care that she's hurt. She's just in a panic because her girls are missing. So she ends up calling the police and she just screams in the phone, you left me. They took my daughters. And so the police end up immediately coming back and they see Chris's state and they see that the girls are missing. And then they're like, oh shit, like she was telling the truth. You can tell that they know that they screwed up and they're just trying to help Chris. They're trying to help her find her daughters. And she's like, let's go find my mom. She was still in the house. Susan was still in her room. So they go up to Susan's room and the cops start demanding Susan give them answers and tell them where the girls are. But Susan is just like, those are not her kids. They're Ed's kids too. Sarah is actually his biological daughter. She can't just take them. And as Susan is saying this to the officers, they all start hearing this banging sound in the closet in Susan's room. And when they open it, they find Tiffany, the older daughter, in the closet with one of the women from the cult. And she was just kind of like huddled up in the closet, and you could tell she had been hysterically crying and she was trying to kick her way out. So the officers scoop Tiffany up and give Tiffany to Chris, and they end up finding out that Ed has taken off with Sarah. He's not even in the house. So then they tell Susan that as soon as Ed returns, as soon as she hears from him, whatever happens, that she needs to send Ed to the police station and bring Sarah back. And then they end up taking Chris and Tiffany into the station, and they're kind of questioning Chris a little bit, talking to her about everything that's going on. But before she could really get into exactly what had been going on within the cult, a call comes in for Chris. And when Chris picks up the phone, she hears the voice of a lawyer who's actually a cult member. And the lawyer tells her that if she doesn't say anything and if she doesn't sign anything, that they will give her Sarah back. And so Chris is like, fine, I won't say anything. I won't sign anything. I just want my daughter back. And I wish that we could continue on with Chris's story because she does leave the cult. She never returns. A lot of stuff does happen with her in her life. But she does seem like she created a really sound, secure life for her and her daughters. She was followed by the cult for several years. They would find out where she lived and she'd have to uproot everybody and move somewhere else. This did happen quite a bit, but it sounds like she was a very good mother to her daughters and she did have a good life. And she comes up a little bit later on in the story, but this is kind of where we leave Chris at this point. Okay, so now we are in 1970 and there are 200 followers in this cult at this point, and they're all living in that 2-story house near the Sunset Strip. And the authorities are starting to get very annoyed again, but this time it wasn't the LAPD, it was actually the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. They started getting physical with some of the members. They would beat up some of the kids in the street. They were giving citations left and right. They were way more aggressive than the LAPD had ever been with Susan and Tony. So once again, Susan makes the decision that it's time for the cult to leave and go find a different place. So they end up landing in this place called Saugus Canyon, California, which is about 45 minutes outside of Hollywood. And they basically turned this new place into a compound. There was an old restaurant that had been on the property that they converted into a church. There were several like chicken coops and hog pens and things like that that were already on the property that they converted into like bunk houses, basically. They also built a wall around the compound and they had armed guards standing there day and night. And the conditions of this compound were absolutely atrocious. As I said, they converted these old chicken coops and hog pens into bunk houses, and they would have 20 to 30 people staying in one of these little bunk houses. They also rationed electricity, food, clean water, those kind of things, those essential things that you need in life. They were rationed very strictly. So a lot of times the followers were going hungry and they were dirty and they couldn't even clean their babies' diapers, because that's another thing. They were not given disposable diapers for their babies. They had to use cloth diapers and they couldn't even clean these diapers. So the diapers would actually get maggots in them, which is, oh God, that's so gross. And then Susan would yell at the mothers for letting their babies' diapers get full of maggots, but they weren't being given water to even clean out these diapers. So they had no way to make this any better. They were just living in absolutely awful conditions. And the Alamos also had several little businesses that they would force their followers to work in. All the money that they would get from their jobs would be handed right back over to the Alamos. Tony and Susan kept a detailed list of when each person got paid if they had an outside job. And they would come and find you no matter where you were. They would come find you on payday. And they told them that if you're truly a born-again Christian, then you don't need worldly possessions. You don't need money. None of Jesus's followers were ever paid. So this is how they were getting away with making these people work for free. And the sad thing is, a lot of these people happily did this because they thought that they were actually doing something good for God. They thought that they were actually showing God that they were completely devoted. They felt like they were doing this for a bigger reason, for a higher purpose. And Tony and Susan would make their followers work extremely long hours, like 12 to 15 hours per day, every day of the week. And while their followers are living in these absolutely atrocious conditions, Tony and Susan had a big, nice house on the compound that they were living in. They drove a Cadillac. They had nice clothes. They always were dressed really, really nicely with their hair done. They had all the food they wanted to eat, all the water that they needed, all the electricity they wanted. And they were living in this big, nice house while their followers were living in hog pens and chicken coops. And by this point, there were at least 300 people living on the Saugus compound. So they were collecting paychecks from 300 people. That's a lot of money. And as this thing progressed, Susan and Tony definitely became more controlling. I think they felt like they could be a little more controlling since now they had removed these people from the city. They definitely didn't have access to their family members like they had before. They were really isolated on this Saugus compound, so they felt like they could be more controlling. And if anyone wanted to date someone or get married to someone within the cult, they had to ask permission from Tony and Susan. And there was a very real possibility that you could be completely shot down whenever you asked, because they would decide who you married. So if they didn't think you should be married to the person that you wanted to get married to, they would say, no, God doesn't want you to be with that person. He actually wants you to be with this person. And then they would force these people to marry other people, people that they didn't even really know at all. They would also separate families quite a bit, husbands and wives, brothers, sisters, mothers, and children. Even the people that they had arranged marriages for, they would sometimes make them live separately, or they would make them work such long hours that they could never really spend any time together. And in the beginning, they did this in an effort to prevent too many babies being born into the cult, because babies are expensive. They didn't want this extra expense. So in the beginning, they definitely tried to keep the men and women apart as much as they possibly could to prevent too many babies from being born. This whole little thing was abandoned later, and eventually they go on to want more babies being born because they want a new army of Christians. And when they got to the Saugus compound, this is where the beating started. If anyone, including children, got out of line or angered the Alamos or God in any way, they would be punished. There was a little room behind the church, and this is where these beatings would take place. And to my knowledge, Susan and Tony never actually did the beating themselves, but they were the ones that gave the orders. And in the beginning, it was definitely Susan that handed down these orders. So Susan would tell one of the grown men in the cult to go get this wooden paddle that they had, and it had holes drilled all in it. And she would then instruct that man to hit the child as many times as she saw fit, and she would tell them that they needed the devil beaten out of them. If the person doing the beating didn't hit the child hard enough, then they would be threatened. So a lot of times these men would hit these children as hard as they possibly could. And the parents were told that their children were possessed by the devil and that they were doing the right thing because they needed to beat the devil out of the child. This is how the parents were trying to justify this in their mind. The parents were usually present for this, so they were watching their children get beaten. And you're probably wondering, why in the hell would anyone stay in a place like this and watch their children be beaten by these people? It's just absolutely awful to think about. And that's usually what people ask themselves whenever they hear stories like this. And the answer just boils down to brainwashing. It seems insane to us that anyone would stay under these conditions. But to these people, they had been conditioned to think that this is what they needed to do to make it to heaven and not burn for all eternity. They believed everything Susan and Tony ever said. And Susan and Tony loved talking about burning in hell. This is what the sermons are all about all the time. It's always fire and brimstone and all of these terrible things that will happen to you if you disobey God. And at this point, the followers believe that Susan is some sort of embodiment of Christ. They think that she is a prophet. So they did what their prophet told them because she is the direct line to God. So now that the cult is outside of the busy Hollywood, LA area, they had to kind of get creative whenever it came to recruiting new members. So they decided that they were going to get this bus. And this bus had Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation across one side. And on the back, it read, "The world is coming to an end. Are you ready to meet God?" So the members of the cult would take shifts and they would get on the bus and they would be bused to the busy areas of Hollywood and LA. And they would do the same thing that they had done before with giving out leaflets and doing all the street preaching and stuff like that. Except this time, whenever they would meet a potential member, they would do the same thing. You know, you need to come and listen to Susan preach and you'll get a free meal. Remember the trash can meal? And then they would just tell them, you know, meet us back here at this time because that's whenever we're going to be taking the bus back to the church. They did attract a lot of people by doing this. There were several people that decided to get on the bus. So then they would be bused back to the Saugus compound and they would be shown only the best things about the cult. And the people within the cult have said that they were very good actors. They would act like this was just like the most amazing experience of their lives and they were happier than they ever had been. And they would put on this big show for these new recruits, and they did attract a lot of new membership. And by 1973, the cult was growing fast. And Tony and Susan end up landing their very own TV show that was nationally broadcasted.
Jews, Gentiles, every color, every race. Oh, so many, many, many of the parents of our young people have been born again at the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation. So we know that that blood that was shed upon the old rugged cross is a living reality. It's the power of God unto salvation. And now Tony Alamo to sing the old rugged cross.
Tony and Susan became very popular. They ended up becoming household names because of this show. Now, things are going great for the Alamos, right? They've got all these followers. They're making tons of money from stealing from their followers and from this new TV show that they have. So things are great until the authorities start becoming suspicious because they're seeing all the money that's going through this church. And the authorities are starting to become suspicious that the Alamos are not paying their employees. So once Tony and Susan find out that authorities are now kind of suspicious of them, they do what they always do and they decide that they need to move. They need to get their followers and go to a different location. And this time they decide that they're going to just completely leave California in general. They feel like they're just kind of too known in California. They really just need to get out of the state. So they decide to go to Arkansas, which is where Susan was born and raised. And Susan tries to justify this move to Arkansas by telling everyone that she had had a religious experience when she lived there as a child. She told everyone that whenever she was about 9 years old that she had tuberculosis and that she was dying from it. Her whole body was just being ravaged by tuberculosis. And she said God appeared and he put his hand on her and he healed her. And this was the moment she became a Christian. This was her story. Now, her daughter Chris has later said that there are several different versions of this story. So this is likely not really why she converted to Christianity. This is probably just something that she, again, fabricated just to manipulate her followers. But this is what she tells them. And of course, they believe it. So they're like, okay, cool, let's go. So in 1975, Susan and Tony moved their followers to Alma, Arkansas, which is this super, super small town in Arkansas. It's just right at the base of the Ozark Mountains. So funny story about Alma, Arkansas. I've actually been there. And if you don't want to hear this, if you don't care, just skip ahead like 2 minutes. It has nothing to do with the case, but I just found it to be a crazy coincidence and I just felt like I needed to share it. So this past summer, right before I started this channel, I had already been working on it. I'd already filmed my first case, but I hadn't posted the video yet. My family and I decided to take a trip to Arkansas and we wanted to go hiking and stuff. So I just randomly picked an Airbnb that I liked within the state of Arkansas. We didn't know anything about the place, so we didn't have like a particular place we were looking. And I just happened to pick this Airbnb in Alma, Arkansas. And right before we got there, I started reading about the town and realized that Alma, Arkansas was the place where Tony and Susan Alamo moved their cult and created this compound. And then I found out that the Airbnb that I booked was right next door to this mansion that Tony and Susan had built. What a weird coincidence is that? Like, this channel was already going to be about cults and true crime and stuff. And I just happened to book this Airbnb, just randomly booked this Airbnb on a whim, and it's right next door to a compound where this cult had been. And that's actually how I found out about this cult in the first place, and that's when I decided that eventually I was going to have to do a video on it. And when we got there and I realized that this house was right next door to our Airbnb, I tried to be brave and kind of go onto the property a little bit. But I got kind of scared whenever I ended up reading that there are actually still active members of this cult today. And the house itself is abandoned, but it looks really creepy, honestly. So I kind of got scared to go onto the property, but I just ended up just staying on our Airbnb property and taking a picture from there. And you can see how close we actually were. But anyways, it has nothing to do with the story, but I just felt like I wanted to mention it because it was just such a weird coincidence to me. But anyways, back to the story. So they build this compound in Alma, Arkansas, and not only do they build a compound, they actually start building all these businesses. They have a ton of different Alamo businesses within the town of Alma. They have a grocery store, a gas station, they've got a car repair shop, they've got a restaurant, just all these businesses. And guess who works at these businesses free of charge? That's right, their followers. And same thing here, they would force them to work very, very long hours, and they would either get paid nothing or they would get paid extremely little. Almost all of the profits went directly into Susan and Tony's pocket. And remember, at this point, they have tax exempt status because they filed to become an actual religious organization. So they're not paying taxes either. And they're telling the story that these businesses are being started for the sole purpose of funding the church. So that's how they're trying to justify not paying taxes on any of these businesses and not paying their employees. They also tell their employees that if they're true Christians, that they wouldn't need to get paid because they're doing God's work. all the money is going directly back into the church. And by 1975, all of the Alamo businesses that had been started over the years had now made a profit of over $1 million. And like I said, one of the businesses that they opened was a restaurant. And this restaurant became famous in Arkansas. It attracted lots of different celebrities. Big country stars of the time would come to this restaurant to perform. Some of the people that had been seen at this restaurant included Dolly Parton, Buck Owens, Hank Williams Jr., Roy Orbison, Tammy Wynette, and other big names within the country music industry. And Susan and Tony were really starting to rub elbows with a lot of big names within the industry. And of course, this is something that they had wanted for a very long time, and it was finally happening for them. Bill and Hillary Clinton even visited the restaurant at one point. And Bill Clinton, in his autobiography, later described Tony Alamo as Roy Orbison on speed. And once again, all this fame and flash starts to attract the eyes of the authorities. They're wondering how this religious organization is able to do all of this and how the Alamos are able to live this super lavish lifestyle while their followers are obviously not. So once again, they are under investigation. And they start pulling information from businesses dating back to 1970. And in 1977, the Department of Labor ended up filing a lawsuit against the Alamos for wage violations. They had estimated that the Alamos owed more than $19 million in back wages. And people within Arkansas definitely kind of started wondering what was going on the compound. They thought that they were weird. They didn't know what was going on. They just thought that something funny was going on up there. So in an attempt to escape the eyes of authorities and to kind of get away from some of the people that were kind of questioning them, they end up going to Dyer, Arkansas, which is right by Alma. It's another very, very small town, and they build a 243-acre compound on this property. And they call this compound Georgia Ridge. And all of the illegal labor just continued once they got there. And this compound had only 2 ways in, and they were both guarded day and night by armed guards. Susan and Tony did not provide birth control to their followers either. So by this point, several children had been born into the cult. And it's said that the Alamos actually did this on purpose to build up their next generation of workers. And this would also trap the parents into the cult because remember, a lot of these people had come into the cult when they were extremely young, and now this is kind of all they knew. So if they had all these children to take care of, they would be less likely to leave because they wouldn't really know what to do or where to go. They would basically stay out of desperation. And this detail really makes me sick considering what Tony goes on to do later on in the story. But the kids that were born into the cult called him Papa Tony. Ugh. And oh God, it just seriously makes me sick. And Susan was referred to as Grandma Susie. So on the Georgia Ridge property, there was something called the Spec House. And I think that this is the main house. I'm pretty sure that's what they're talking about. And this is the house that I was next to in my Airbnb. I'm pretty sure that I'm right about that. But they had the Spec House, and that's where they kept like the Ask Tony list and the Put on Report list. And people would tell on everybody all the time. The kids would tell on themselves for doing things. They would tell on themselves for thinking bad thoughts, for thinking about doing something bad, just anything and everything. They were afraid that if they didn't tell on themselves that God was going to know and God was going to make them burn in hell. This is something that they had been taught since birth. These children knew nothing different than what they had learned in the cult. They were born into this. They were educated by the cult. They were clothed, fed, housed, everything surrounding the cult. This is what their life was. And this part really makes me sick, but the parents would go put their children on report. They knew what was happening to these children. How could you go put your child on a list knowing what was going to happen to them, knowing that you were going to have to watch them be beaten by cult members? I just feel like it's like the ultimate betrayal, honestly, for those parents to know that their child was going to be beaten. But these people did this because they thought that this was how they were going to get into heaven. And they were told that if their kids acted up, that it was because they were devil possessed. And so they were told that they needed to be beaten so they could have the devil beaten out of them. And these kids had been taught that Susan, especially, but Tony too, were basically like their gods. They were told that they were prophets and that what they said needed to be obeyed because they were the direct line to God. So these kids lived in constant fear. Those kids who are now adults have later reported that they lived in terror. They constantly were afraid of everything, and they would have terrible nightmares about burning in hell. So we're going to flash forward just a little bit. We're now in 1981, and Susan and Tony actually get a second TV show, which basically was just showcasing their Christian community. It was, to me, it seemed like almost like an anti-smear campaign for their cult, if that's a thing.
Different fundamental Christian works are being attacked so viciously and accused of such unbelievable things. People that would stand up and make such remarks as people being fed like animals. And just off the wall, complete, just almost impossible to believe that people could be saying such things. Then there is a reason for it. And the reason is clear cut. It means that every person, regardless of who they are, that everything they have ever believed in their life is ready to slip away.
And not long after the second TV show started, Susan got some pretty shocking news. Susan found out that she had terminal cancer. After faking cancer for so many years and using it as a manipulation tactic against her followers, Susan finally actually did have cancer. So after her diagnosis, the doctors were like, okay, we've got to operate immediately. This is really serious. So they do an operation and they go in so they can kind of explore and see what's going on. And when they opened Susan up, the cancer had completely consumed her body. So they basically just had to sew her back up and send her home. And Tony was in a panic now. He knew that Susan was going to be dead soon. He also knew that those people did not follow him. They followed her. And so Tony started to panic that the followers were not going to follow him once Susan died. And on April 8th, 1982, Susan Alamo dies of cancer at the age of 56. And one of the cult members who was really close to Tony and Susan at the time has reported that they were present right before Susan passed away. He said that he heard Susan tell Tony to just let the followers go, to end all of this, because she knew that Tony was going to destroy the whole thing. She didn't trust him. She knew that something bad was going to happen. And I don't even think Susan could have guessed what Tony was going to go on to do. And I really wish that Tony would have listened to Susan when she begged him to end this, but he didn't. Susan wasn't there anymore to keep Tony's dark side at bay. And once she died, things got so much worse. So many horrific and bizarre things happen when Tony takes over, starting with the day of Susan's funeral. So after the funeral service for Susan, instead of sending Susan's body to like the cemetery or crematorium, wherever she was going to go, Tony has her body delivered to the Georgia Ridge compound. And he turns the main house into a prayer chapel. And there he set Susan's embalmed body in the middle of the house, and then tells his followers that they are going to raise her from the dead. He tells them that with the power of prayer and faith, that they're going to bring Susan back to life. So he orders 2-hour-long prayer shifts so that there's always someone praying 24/7. So they would take turns. A group would go and pray for 2 hours next to Susan's dead body. Then they would leave and another group would come in. And this happened continuously 24/7. And Tony knew that this was a total lie. He never believed for 1 second that he was going to resurrect Susan. This was all just a way to keep the followers loyal to him, because if he still had a hold of Susan physically, he felt like he would still have a hold of the cult. And he would even say that Susan was giving him messages from God. Just when you think this man cannot stoop any lower, and I'm honestly not exactly sure how long he kept that body in the house. I have read reports that it was over a year. I'm not too sure about that. I couldn't really find out exactly how long it was. But eventually, one of the cult members did go to Tony and was like, Tony, like her body is starting to rot, like her skin's coming off. We have got to bury her. So Tony then has a mausoleum built right there on the Georgia Ridge property, and that's where he's going to put her. But he tells his followers, don't worry, She still could come back. She still could be resurrected. And once Susan was in the mausoleum, this is when Tony's mask really just came right off. He became an absolute monster. Every terrible urge and desire that he had been keeping at bay while Susan was alive slowly began trickling out. There's even been reports that he started using cocaine after Susan died. He also started traveling around a lot while Susan was in the mausoleum, but he would still record his sermons and he would send tapes back to the compound that would be played to the followers. And remember that lawsuit that the Department of Labor had against Tony and they were waiting for trial? Well, they're finally ready. So pretty soon after Susan passed away, they go to court and Tony ends up losing. He is told that he now owes $19 million in back wages. And not only that, the IRS has now started their own investigation into Tony. And at this point, Tony was estimating that all of his businesses combined were worth over $50 million. So Susan definitely set him up and left him a very wealthy man. And this is also when Tony really ramped up his hatred of the government. They were one of the biggest enemies of the church. And he told his followers that they're going to try to persecute him and he would be the one to take the fall because he's the leader, but that he would be willing to do it because he's fighting for God and this is God's work. Basically making himself out to be a martyr. And around this time, the beatings of the children got way worse. Even when Tony was not physically there, he would call and get on speakerphone and be giving orders to the cult members to conduct these public beatings. And he would tell them how many times they needed to be beaten and all this stuff. And he would stay on the phone and listen as these children were beaten. So things in the cult were really starting to get worse around this time. And we still have so many more things to get through because it gets so much worse. So now we're going to move forward again. It's now 1984 and Tony has now started dating a Swedish fashion designer from Los Angeles. Her name was Birgitta and she looked so much like Susan Alamo. It was creepy. And after a very quick courtship, Tony proposed to Birgitta and she said yes, and they got married. And she ended up having to move to Arkansas, which she was not thrilled about. She was a city girl. She did not want to be out in the country, but she did it. And some people even speculated that when Tony first met Birgitta, he was planning to try to pass her off as the resurrected Susan Alamo. And around this time is when the Tony Alamo jackets really took off. Birgitta has introduced Tony to some fashion people in New York. They were now being sold in all these really mainstream shops, and they were making tons and tons of money. And guess who was making these jackets for free? Right, the followers, but not only the adult followers. They have these children making these jackets free of charge. They would make the kids go to their evening prayer service, and then after that they would be bused to this sweatshop where they would be putting together these jackets. And they never saw anything from the work that they did on those jackets. They became extremely popular. They were basically like jackets to the stars. There were a lot of very famous people that wore these jackets. And Michael Jackson even wore a customized leather Alamo jacket on the cover of his album Bad. And oh my God, it's just so crazy to think that these jackets were being worn by all these celebrities who had no idea that literal children were making them. Now, Tony and Birgitta's marriage was pretty much doomed from the start. Birgitta was supposed to basically take Susan's place. In Tony's eyes, that's what was happening. He needed a replacement for Susan. And even though Birgitta looked like Susan, like a lot like Susan, she was nothing like Susan. For one thing, Tony wanted her to go to church and be really involved in the church aspect of this cult, but Birgitta wasn't religious. This just wasn't her thing. That was not her beliefs, but Tony kept pushing and pushing and pushing her to be involved. And Tony became extremely violent with Birgitta. He beat her on several occasions. He even tried to strangle her several times. And typically he would get physical like this whenever Birgitta would refuse sex. Birgitta later said that Tony was only happy and calm when she would have sex with him at least 3 times a day. But she said even if it was only twice that day and she didn't feel like having sex again, Tony would tell her that he needed to go pray on it, and he would go away and go pray and talk to God, and then he would come back and he would say, God thinks that you need to be punished for this. I need to beat you. And he would beat Birgitta for not having sex with him. So their marriage was very quickly breaking down. So after about 2 years of marriage, Brigitte did leave Tony. He, of course, didn't let her go peacefully. He had people follow her for years. We are now in 1985, and the Supreme Court has upheld the ruling in the Department of Labor case. Tony did appeal the decision to have to pay all this back money in wages and overtime payment, and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the decision that the court had made. So he was going to have to pay all that money back. And just 4 months after that ruling, the IRS had completed their investigation. They decided to retroactively revoke the Alamo Foundation's tax-exempt status. Tony now owed $7.9 million in back taxes. These were both huge financial blows to the foundation. And if all that wasn't bad enough for Tony, in 1988, he was charged with child abuse. And the story that I'm about to tell you is not going to be easy to hear. So there was a boy named Justin Miller who was 11 years old, and he had been living with his mother and father at the Georgia Ridge compound in Arkansas. And his father, Kerry Miller, one day decided that he felt like they needed to leave the cult. He started to become very aware of all the beatings that were going on, and it just really freaked him out, especially because he was worried about his son. Justin had actually been adopted by the Millers. He was about 5 years old when he was adopted. So Kerry wasn't super familiar with all these beatings that were going on. And when he found out, he freaked out and he wanted to leave the cult. So he decides to go to his wife and tell her that he really felt like they needed to leave. He needed to get Justin out of there. He was just starting to get really uneasy about the way things were going. But Kerry's wife was very much brainwashed by the cult. So she was not willing to leave. And as soon as Tony found out that Kerry was planning to leave, he threw Kerry out of the cult. He actually had people chase him out with guns. Kerry actually left with his brother. His brother was also in the cult as well. He was in a very similar situation. He was trying to get his kids out of there. So they end up getting in their car, they take off. But once they start going down the road, they realize that they just can't leave their kids. So they devised a plan to return one night and get their children. So they get to the compound and they know exactly where to go as far as like where the guards are and cameras and stuff. So they sneak in and Kerry goes into his wife's room and he taps her on the shoulder and he's like, "Hey, I'm here, let's get out of here, let's go." And he's pleading with her. He's trying again to plead with her to leave. She just immediately flies up and she just screams for the guards. And so the guards immediately come in and they chase Kerry off. He jumps out the window and again, he just takes off in the woods. And his brother was not successful in getting his kids either. So they end up having to leave the compound without their children. Now, once this happened, Tony started to get worried that Kerry and his brother were going to show back up. He ends up having Kerry's wife and his son Justin, along with Kerry's brother's kids and his wife, all move to the Saugus compound in California. And he did this in an effort to just kind of throw Kerry off the trail and kind of confuse him as to where his son even was. I think he knew that Kerry wasn't going to give up and he was going to end up coming back, and this kind of freaked him out. So yeah, he moves them all to the Saugus compound. A little bit of time goes by and Kerry and his brother just can't stop thinking about their children. They decide, we have to go get them. But then they find out that they've been moved and they don't know where. And then eventually they end up finding out that their families have been moved to Saugus, California. So instead of just barging into the Saugus compound, they end up getting the authorities involved and they come to the Saugus compound with them. And so Kerry, his brother, and the officers all arrive on the Saugus compound and they do find their children and they are reunited with their children. And Kerry is absolutely elated to have Justin back. But then Justin tells him that something terrible had happened while he was staying at the Saugus compound. Justin tells his father that he was severely beaten by members of the cult on Tony Alamo's orders. So once Justin and his mother had been sent to the Saugus compound, rumors started going around that Justin still loved his father. I know, terrible, right? A kid loving his father. Whenever you were exiled from the cult, your family was supposed to just forget about you. They were supposed to basically act as if you were dead. They weren't supposed to love you. They weren't supposed to think about you. They weren't supposed to care about you anymore. There were rumors going around that Justin still loved Carrie. So when Tony hears about these rumors, he's actually still in Arkansas, but he calls up the Saugus compound and he tells them to put him on speakerphone, and then he orders the public beating of Justin. So then Tony orders 3 grown men to hold Justin Miller down, while another man in the cult takes the paddle and holds it as if he's holding a baseball bat, and then proceeds to relentlessly beat Justin. And he was hitting him mainly like on his bottom area, and the man who was giving the beating actually got tired after a while, so another person had to come in and take over where he left off. And by the end of it, Justin had been hit at least 155 times. And he was bleeding. There were kids watching this happen. They had been ordered to sit and watch as Justin got beat. Those children, who are adults now, have reported that they could see blood coming out of Justin's pants. And after this happened, Justin had a really long recovery. He couldn't even walk at first. And to make matters even worse, Justin's mother was present for this whole thing, and she just watched as this happened. And during the beating, Justin actually made eye contact with his mother, and he asked her why she was letting this happen. And she basically just told him to shut up because he deserved it. Just take a minute and think about the magnitude of that. And the entire time Justin was being beaten, Tony was on speakerphone and he was just reading scriptures out loud while Justin was being beat. And I'm really sorry. I know that was probably very hard to hear. When I first heard that story, I cried. I just can't even imagine what that little boy went through. And he's an adult now, but I'm sure that that's still with him. It's probably something that you don't ever forget and you never heal from. So as you can probably imagine, Carrie Miller hears this and he's absolutely horrified at what Justin's telling him, and he immediately tells the police. The police get involved right away. They put a warrant out for Tony's arrest. But Tony was not in Arkansas at the time of this warrant. He was actually in New York City promoting his jackets. And as soon as Tony finds out that he's being charged with child abuse, he just goes on the run. So as you can imagine, the media finds out about all this and it's all over the news. And honestly, Justin Miller is only 11 years old and he's so brave because he was just very openly telling his story. He told everything. So then Carrie Miller and his brother decided they're going to bring a civil lawsuit against Tony Alamo. So it's now 1990 and Tony has been on the run for 2 years. And Carrie and his brother's lawsuit, the civil lawsuit, is now supposed to go to trial. And Tony does not show up. So then Carrie and his brother were then awarded $1.8 million in damages. And he's actually on the run for 2 years. But he's still recording sermons and having them sent to Arkansas. So he still keeps his hold over the cult, even though he's not there. Not only is he recording sermons still and having them sent to his compound, he's also drawing up sketches for new designs on his Tony Alamo Designs jackets.
On average, they're averaging better than I thought they would.
Buyers came from everywhere.
We do very well with him. He has a really fine product. I may not agree with the politics of the situation, but the product's really good.
Rumors had been circulating that Tony Alamo might make a surprise appearance. U.S. Marshals say they'd welcome that.
Although the auction started off slow, the pace picked up once the most prized and sought-after jackets were offered. They'll be sold in bundles when day 2 of the auction continues. In Alma, Pamela Smith, Channel 7 News.
And he's still ordering beatings of children while he's on the run. So to satisfy this judgment, they end up deciding to seize some of the Alamo property. They know that there's a ton of very expensive things up at the Georgia Ridge compound, so they decide that this is how they're going to handle this whole lawsuit thing. They're going to go seize a bunch of property. So the authorities head up there, and Carrie and his brother actually go with the authorities up to the Georgia Ridge compound to do the seizure of the property. But word has already made its way to Tony while he's been on the run that this is going to happen, that there's going to be a raid of his compound. So he calls up the Georgia Ridge compound and he just warns them. He's like, just letting you know, they're on their way. They're going to come raid the place. And he's got his followers believing that anyone in government is the devil. So he's got them completely freaked out. And he tells them just to leave and to basically scatter all across the United States. And that he would get with them later for further orders. And there are about 300 people living on Georgia Ridge at this point. And as soon as federal agents show up, all these 300 members of this cult just start running. There were people running into the woods. There were people running off the ridge of the compound. People were jumping out of windows. People were just leaving boiling pots of water on the stove without even turning it off. I mean, it looked as if people had just been in an absolute panic and just bolted. But they weren't there for the people. They were there to seize property at the Alamo compound. So they start going through everything. They start basically just looking all over the property. And then they see something pretty interesting. They find the mausoleum that Susan Alamo's body has been stored in has been broken into and her body has been stolen. Tony ordered some of his cult members to break open the mausoleum before they left, load up Susan Alamo's body, and transport her to an unknown location. He could not let Susan go. He had to keep hold of her because in his mind, if he kept hold of her, he keeps hold of the cult. So now all these people on Georgia Ridge have dispersed. They're all across the United States. He had ordered them to break up into factions. He basically just said, just go wherever you need to go and wait for my next order. So all the families go their separate ways for now. And this is where the cult should have ended. These people should have left for good. Tony should have been found and put in prison for a very long time. But sadly, it wasn't the end, and we still have some pretty terrible things to talk about. So after the raid on Georgia Ridge, a lot of Tony's businesses were being shut down and auctioned off. So the Tony Alamo empire is just crumbling to the ground. So about a week after the Georgia Ridge compound raid, Tony makes a really dumb move. So he calls up this journalist for this newspaper and he just starts mouthing off. So he tells this journalist that he, Tony, is going to get Judge Morris Arnold, who is the judge that ruled against him in this lawsuit, and he is going to bring him to God's court. And Tony would be the judge this time, and Judge Morris Arnold would be found guilty and hanged by the neck until dead. So the journalist writes all this, and it ends up making the front page of this newspaper, and it catches the attention of the FBI. And this judge was a United States district judge. So this definitely caught the attention of the FBI. And then it was on. A full-blown manhunt began after Tony made this mistake. The FBI and the U.S. Marshals were looking for him. And in addition to this, Chris, Susan's daughter Chris, she finds out that Tony has stolen her mother's body. So she files her own lawsuit against him because she wants her mother's body back. She wants her buried somewhere. She is sick and tired of hearing all these rumors about Tony taking her mother's body and having people pray over her and trying to raise her from the dead. Like, that was bad enough. But now he's broken into this mausoleum and he's stolen her body and taken her somewhere. So Chris has finally had enough. So she files this lawsuit to basically sue Tony to get her mother's body back. And because of everything going on, another raid was actually done at the Georgia Ridge compound. So during this raid, the authorities end up finding this very detailed list of every single member of the cult. And this list included everything: their name, their date of birth, their driver's license number, their license plate number, their phone number. So the FBI starts keeping tabs on some of these phone numbers that they're seeing on this list, and they start tracking all the incoming and outgoing calls that they're seeing coming through these phone numbers. And eventually they start seeing a pattern. There's one number that keeps calling out of Tampa, Florida, and they always call once in the morning and once in the evening. So they feel like this is kind of suspicious. So they decide to go ahead and go to Tampa to kind of look around. And after weeks of surveillance, they end up finally finding Tony Alamo. So they end up taking him back to Arkansas so he could face charges for threatening the judge. And he was actually acquitted on those charges, which I find really odd. But he had a lot of other charges to answer for at this point. But instead of making Tony wait in prison because he's a flight risk, he's been on the run for over 2 years now, they actually let him go on bond. He ended up having to pay like $200,000 and then he could just await trial at home, which again, I just think is so weird and just a really, really poor decision. And of course, as soon as Tony is released on bond, he starts calling all of his cult members back. And they're still in Arkansas, but this time he calls them back to Fort Smith, which isn't that far from Alma, and the nightmare just picks up where it left off. And as insane as this sounds, new members were still joining at this point. This man's name has been all over the news. It's been all in the newspapers, all over TV, and new members are still joining. And they end up opening up a new church and starting another compound. And the next thing I'm going to tell you about is, again, going to be very hard to hear, because this is when the sexual abuse of the young girls in the cult really starts. So Tony began to talk about polygamy quite a bit. He had decided that he was going to follow the Old Testament, and in the Old Testament, there's some stuff in there about polygamy being okay, and he starts adding polygamy talk into his daily sermons. And this had never been anything that the Alamos had talked about before, so this was definitely odd for the members to hear. And in addition to the polygamy talk Tony began to preach, he also started saying that the Bible says that it's okay to marry girls once they've hit puberty. Tony was actually quoted saying, "When a woman reaches puberty, she, according to God, is able to be married. They should be able to be married at 13, 14, and 15 years old, and in some cases, if they've menstruated already, 12 years old." Tony Alamo said that, and I truly don't understand why no one was freaking out at this point. And this is when Tony starts taking very young girls in the cult as his wives, and he begins sexually abusing them. And most of these girls had been born into the cult, so Tony had known them since birth. And what he would do is he would invite these girls to come live with him at his home. And this was seen as a privilege in the cult because Tony was the one that had this amazing house and always had tons of food and all kind of luxuries. So these young girls, they didn't know what they were getting themselves into. They thought they were just going to go live in this really cool house and they were going to be closer to the prophet. So it was seen as some kind of privilege for them. But then the girls would get there, and once Tony was comfortable, he would start the grooming process. He would tell them that God had spoken to him and told him that they were to be his wives. And then he would, one by one, take them into like his room, and he had like a box of rings, just like spare rings, and he would say a couple of words and put a ring on their finger, and then he would say that they were married. And then he would tell these girls that they were supposed to consummate the marriage. A lot of these girls were so young, they didn't even know what that meant. And that is when Tony would rape them. And most of these girls were in their teens, between like 13 and 16 years old. He did have some people that he called his wives that were adults. They were considered adults, but there were several children. And all these women lived in this house together. And the parents of these girls, the people that should have saved them, thought that this was some sort of honor, that the prophet would choose their child to marry him. And Tony would keep extremely close tabs on these girls. He really wouldn't allow them to have any freedoms at all. And he was physically abusive towards them as well. And this is really horrible. But the youngest of Tony's victims was only 8 years old. Tony did the same thing to her that he had done to the others. He told her that God had said she was to be his wife. He brought her into the room, he gave her a ring, told her it was time to consummate the marriage, and being 8 years old, she had no clue what that meant. And then he raped her. And this girl had no clue what was going on. She was only 8 years old. And this little girl's name was Desiree. And what's even worse is one day, Desiree's mother came to Tony's house to visit her daughter. When she got there, Desiree started crying and pleading with her mother to take her home. Her mother said that she couldn't. She would have to ask Tony's permission first. Brainwashed or not, these people should know the difference between right and wrong. Would any God want this to happen to anyone, much less a child, an 8-year-old child? And in these cases, these cult cases, I really try not to be judgmental because I've never been brainwashed. So I try not to put too much blame on parents when stuff like this happens, but it's really hard sometimes. How could anyone let this happen to their child? I don't understand it. I won't. I never will. I just don't get it. Surely some tiny little rational piece of your brain that is left should tell you this isn't right. No God would want this. So remember, as all of this is going on, Tony is actually awaiting trial for tax evasion and for child abuse. So the IRS case ends up going first, and in 1994, Tony was found guilty on all charges, and he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. And once again, I know I keep saying this, I probably sound like a broken record, but this would be the perfect time for people to get out. He is now incarcerated. Perfect time for everyone to leave, right? But again, this doesn't happen. And if anything, Tony being in prison actually gave him a stronger hold over the cult, because he was seen as almost like this symbol of the government coming after religion, like he had sacrificed himself for this cause or something. So the cult members actually felt like they owed Tony because he was doing some service for them. And he was still giving sermons while in prison. He would either do it over the phone, who was giving this man a phone, or he would tape them and have them sent to the compound, who is giving this man a tape recorder. And during one of these sermons, he ends up instructing his followers to buy some property in Fouke, Arkansas. And this is another really small town. It's kind of similar to Alma. So in 1994, all the cult members that were in that area in Arkansas, they all moved to Fouke. So while Tony is in prison, his underage wives, victims, would go visit him quite often. And while they were there, they would be molested. And the other underage wives would be instructed to form a sort of wall around Tony while he did this. Yes, this man was molesting little girls while he was in prison. And while Tony was incarcerated, all of his wives did live together in the Fouke home. And they were basically just instructed to just wait there for him to get out. And throughout the entirety of Tony's stay in prison, he was receiving visits from his underage wives, and he was molesting them on a regular basis. So now we're jumping forward a little bit, and it's now almost time for Tony to be released from prison. But he's told that if he does not return Susan Alamo's body before it's time for him to get out, that basically they would let him out of jail on his release date, and then they would immediately rearrest him and put him back in prison. So Tony finally caves, and he does instruct some of his cult members to get Susan's body and have it anonymously delivered to a funeral home. And Susan was finally laid to rest. But one really annoying thing is that they did still let Tony decide where Susan was going to be buried because he was the husband. And I'm just like, after everything this man has done, the court is still going to let him have that privilege. I just don't think that that should have happened. I think Chris should have been able to decide where her mother was going to be buried, but whatever. So after Susan's body is recovered, Tony is released in prison, and it's now 1998. And Tony just gets out of prison, and he goes and starts living in the Fouke home. And some of the girls that were living in the house, Tony had only met while in prison. He had actually chosen them to be his wife while he was in prison. It sounds like these girls would be brought to the prison so that he could kind of size them up, and then they would be told to go live in the Fouke house and basically wait for Tony to get out of prison. So when he gets out, he comes home to some new girls living in his house. And he does the same thing. He brings them into the room. He will say a few words, put a ring on their finger, and then he tells them that it's time to consummate the marriage. And he rapes them. So in addition to raping these young girls, he would also force them to take nude pictures. So he would make them pose nude, and he would take these pictures and he would keep them for himself. He had a huge collection by the time all this comes crashing down. And Tony just kind of lives like this for the next close to 10 years. And he just continues to sexually assault these young girls. And by the end, he ended up with 24 wives, 9 of which were underage. But Tony's little world was getting ready to come crashing down because some of his ex-cult members, some of them his ex-cult wives, had either escaped or been kicked out of the cult, and they took to the internet and they started posting on forums all about their experience in the cult. And the cult wives were talking all about the sexual abuse. And this ends up finding its way to the FBI, and they're very interested. They're very familiar with Tony Alamo. And so when they hear all of this, that this is the kind of stuff that's been going on in the cult, they knew they needed to go after him. And finally, this is the beginning of the end of Tony Alamo. So in 2006, the youngest of Tony's cult wives, Desiree, the one that was 8 years old when she was taken, she manages to escape. She's now 15, and she had just had enough. And she knew that her mother wasn't going to help her. She knew that if she was going to get out, she had to leave herself. So one night, she just bolts out of the house and she runs into the woods and she manages to escape. And the FBI end up finding out about this, and they end up contacting Desiree and asking her to basically give her testimony so that they can take Tony Alamo down. And Desiree agrees to do this. She gives them a full statement about everything that had happened in that cult and all of the sexual abuse of the young girls. She even tells them about the nude photos of the underage girls. And they feel like this information about the photos is really going to help their case, because then they can get him on child pornography charges. And before Tony is taken to trial, they actually end up finding out about a little girl named Sommer who was 11 years old when she was taken across state lines where Tony raped her. So this gave them another charge to work with, that charge being interstate transportation of a minor for illegal purposes. And once they started digging, they found so many other counts of this. So in the end, there were 10 counts against Tony. So they end up raiding the Falk home, and when they get there, Tony's gone, because of course he probably ended up finding out about all this, so he took off and now he's on the run again. So they go ahead and they start searching the Falk home, and they're looking for these photos that they had been told about. They can't find the photos, but they do find lots of other incriminating evidence. They end up finding the box of rings, they find like ovulation tests and other various things, basically corroborating all the stories that they had heard from the girls. And when the raid happened, his wives were still in the home and they were freaking out. Remember, they had been told to fear authority, fear the government. So they were kind of in a panic. And when this raid happened, a lot of children were actually taken out of the compound and placed into foster care. And the parents of the children were told that they could have their children back as long as they promised to raise them outside of the cult. Some of the parents did agree to these terms, but most of them didn't, and they ended up losing their children. And after being on the run for a little while, the police finally do find Tony hiding out in a little hotel in Arizona. And he is arrested, and he is now awaiting trial. And when the trial started, they ended up having 5 of the underage wives testify against Tony, Desiree being one of the ones that testified. And the defense for Tony called Desiree's mother to the stand, and Desiree's mother testified against her daughter. She told the court that Desiree had always been a liar, and everybody knew that she was a liar, and that she was lying now about Tony. And again, I don't get this. I understand brainwashing. I know that that's a real thing, but how does a mother do this? I truly do not understand. Desiree's mom knew that Desiree had begged her to take her out of that house when she was still so little. She was only 8 years old, and she had denied her daughter. And then now she's sitting on the stand and she is fighting for the person who abused her daughter. And the prosecution had several witnesses to come and testify against Tony, some of which had been in the cult since it started in the 60s. And finally, in 2009, Tony Alamo is found guilty of all 10 charges, and he was given the maximum sentence of 175 years. The judge wanted to make sure that Tony never got out of prison, so he took each charge and just stacked them on top of each other. And in 2017, Tony Alamo died after serving 8 years of his prison sentence. He had uncontrolled diabetes and other health issues, so it just all finally caught up to him. And there are still followers of Tony and Susan Alamos, and one of the biggest groups of followers today is thought to be in Saugus. And some of Tony's cult wives still live together to this day. And the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Ministries cult continues even now to recruit new members. And I just really hope that everyone involved in this cult is okay. I know that it's probably taken a long time to finally get to some sort of healthy mental space, and I just really wish them all the best. And that was the very long case of the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Ministries cult. And if you're still here, thank you so much for hanging in there. Like I said, these cult cases are very, very involved. There's usually a ton of information to go through, especially the really long-lasting cults like this one. This one went on for decades. So there's stuff that I had to leave out of this video just because it would end up being like 6 hours long. And if you found this video interesting and this content is your thing, consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you so much again for watching. See you next time.